So welcome to the June Golden Gate Audubon Speaker Series. Our featured speaker tonight is our board president, Eric Schroeder. We have a few announcements to share with you before we have Don Lemoyne introduce Eric and then have his wonderful talk. So Golden Gate Audubon has 2 staff positions for which we're hiring, a special assistant for communications and a membership coordinator. These are both full-time positions. Please share this information with anyone whom you think might want to apply. And all the information is at goldengateaudubon.org. Eric is an expert in teaching writing, and in retirement, he is sharing those skills with Golden Gate Audubon. We don't usually have very many adult ed classes in the summer, but Eric is teaching a 5-week class in writing about birds on Wednesday evenings starting June 30th. There are just 1 or 2 places left in this class. Please see the education tab on our website if you're interested. We have been slowly resuming our volunteer habitat restoration work. This month, we're very happy that we're back in the East Bay, as well as several sites in San Francisco, both along the Bayshore at Pier 94 and Heron's Head Park, and 2 sites in Golden Gate Park, North Lake, and the Bison Paddock, along with, in the middle of the bay, the Treasure Island Native Plant Nursery. So again, please see our website for more information, and you can also email Janet Carpinelli, our volunteer coordinator. So I'm going to hand it over now to Dawn, who's going to talk about our travel program.
Well, hi, everybody. The most interesting thing happened at the end of Memorial Day weekend. I mean, Monday night, all of a sudden, the Golden Gate Audubon program, travel program, began receiving emails that people wanted to travel. And to us, this signals that, that like all of us, we are ready to start living and traveling again. So what you see here now, because of this big rush, is the only trips that are left for 2022. So you're going to need to get on the ball if you want to be part of one of these wonderful trips. So real quickly, we have 2 spaces left in Oaxaca, a really, really special trip that I wish I could take this year. We have 1 space left in the Heart of Chile trip, which goes with this extension all the way down to Patagonia. Then Eddie and Noreen are repeating their South Florida in winter trip, a trip that people really enjoyed just before the pandemic. Then with our new, our relatively new vendor that we are crazy about, Birding Eager Tours, we have several trips. In May, we have the Spring Migration Sensation, and you may have heard me say this before, but if you have never experienced migration at McGee's Marsh, you are really missing something. The birds have just crossed the entire United States, and then they see this giant body of water, and they just say, oh my, we need to rest before we take off. Something not to be missed. Uganda, late breaking news here is Uganda has 1 space left. A really special trip in July with 2 optional treks, 1 to see the mountain gorillas and 1 to see chimpanzees. Then also with Birding Eager Tours in September, we have the Namibia and Botswana safari, which has multiple spots left. and the Brazil trip in September, which has multiple spots left. And finally, in October, we have Madagascar Magic, again with birding ecotours. So if any of this sounds interesting to you, give us an email. Our email there is at the bottom of the screen, travelprogram@goldengateaudubon.org. All the details for these trips are on the website, which you can now see, goldengateaudubon.org/travel with GGAS. That's all I have to say about travel, but the last trip really segues nicely into my next duty for the night, which is to introduce our speaker. I have the distinct honor of welcoming Eric Schroeder to talk to us tonight. Many of you know Eric as the president of our board of directors, but Eric has also participated in multiple Christmas bird counts. He's worked hard and participated in multiple birdathons. And I know Eric best from the Golden Gate Audubon travel desk, where he and I have had a lot of fun together planning trips for you, our members. With all that work, believe it or not, Eric had a life before Golden Gate Audubon. He, at UC Davis, was both a lecturer and the faculty director of the Study Abroad program. As part of that Study Abroad program, he has traveled the world, often with birding components to the trips. So he is quite an expert at travel. He's here tonight to tell us about his Madagascar trip, which, by the way, was a Golden Gate Audubon trip that he took. And as he shows us these amazing birds, he's going to talk about the conservation challenges that they and other animals in Madagascar face. So we'd like you to use the chat for any questions that you have during the presentation, and Eric will answer them when he is done. So with that, I'd like Eric to take it away.
Thanks, Dawn. Let's just swap screens. And get started here. I got to apologize for the way I look on screen. I should start by saying this has probably been one of the worst weeks of my computer life. Don't be alarmed by the black. It might take a minute to boot this up. Here I come. I've had terrible problems with my computer. So the looking fuzzy on the camera is the least of my worries. So I think everything else is going to be fine tonight, and I'm going to get going. Let me give you a little context for tonight's talk. Towards the end of 2018, I realized that I was set up to do a lot of travel in 2019. And I decided to make the most of it by doing what birders call a big year, but most of them have lots of rules and regulations. And my big year was a lowercase b, lowercase y big year. I didn't have any rules or regulations. I was traveling all over, and I was just going to see how many birds I could see in a year. And I had two goals. I was going to try to see 1,000 birds in a year and raise $5,000 for Golden Gate Audubon. And the highlight of the trip for me proved to be the month of October when I did this visit to Madagascar. October is a great month to visit since it's spring there. And as a result, as you'll see, we saw a lot of nesting birds. I did this trip with a birding ecotour. The trip that I'm describing tonight is essentially the one we're offering on the website now. It had a pre-trip extension to the far north, and then the regular kind of Madagascar trip that birding ecotours does, where you start in the center and you work your way south. It was a nice itinerary. It was very appealing. And with that northern piece, I thought I'd see pretty much what I wanted to see if I got lucky. One other note before I get started about the photography. I'm a birder who struggles with a camera. Most of the pictures of birds, mammals, and reptiles I'm going to show were taken on this trip, and the majority by me. But a few of the best of the pictures were taken by Jason Boyce, who was our guide from Birding Ecotours on the trip, and several of them by my birding pal, Tony Reed, who I was traveling with along with his wife, Nancy Bombardieri. I've been birding with them for many years. They're great friends. Tony's kind of like me, struggles a little bit with the camera, but at certain times when I was unlucky, he was lucky. So he's got a few nice shots in here. And there's one very tricky one taken by another participant, Joy Inbody. I'll explain it when I get to it. And then there's a few lovely shots taken by my pal Bob Lewis, photographer extraordinaire, who was not on the trip with me, but had been there several years earlier. And he got some nice shots of birds that I saw, but I didn't get good pictures of. So let's head off to Madagascar. Let's start with a map of the island and some details about the island. It's the second largest island country in the world. It's 1,000 miles long, which is roughly the distance from Portland to LA, 360 miles wide. By comparison, California is 770 miles long and 250 miles wide. So Madagascar is roughly 1.5 times the size of California. And this is an important point. It's over 300 miles at the closest point to the continent of Africa. You'll understand in the course of this talk why that's so significant. Lots of people think of Madagascar as being part of Africa, but it is very, very distinct from Africa. This next thing I'm going to show you is a video that those of you who might have taken our birding and evolution class might have seen this one with Bob. This particular video shows the breakup of the continents, and I want you to watch the bottom of the video here, because as you can see, here's South Africa here, and here's this big chunk of land that we're going to follow in the video. And there's a timeline up here at the top. And the timeline is millions of years. So it starts off a little bit slowly, but then you can see that big chunk that I pointed out breaking off, and a smaller chunk breaking off from the bigger piece. And that smaller chunk is staying more or less in place, while that big piece really accelerates. And that's 88 million years ago that those two pieces separated. And it looks like it's going real fast, but as I say, we're tracking that millions of years above. And that big piece is what becomes India, and it's headed for where the Himalayas now are. So, this explains the isolism of the country. And it also accounts for its extremely high rate of endemism. Plants and animals that are found nowhere else on Earth. 90% of the plants and animals in Madagascar are endemic. And because of the endemism, it's an amazing place for birders. This particular slide shows you some of that, looking at the families. But even before you get to the families, Madagascar has 2 endemic orders of birds. It's got 6 endemic families, and that's the first 6 represented by the first 6 images in this particular slide. It's got approximately 37 genera, and I say approximately because they change all the time. There's a lot of, the work in Birds of Madagascar is ongoing, and it changes from actually year to year. A lot of the, and then it's got this one big genus that I've included with the families because it's got such an amazing variety of birds, and it is the largest genus of birds in Madagascar, with 9 species, though a lot of field guides include 10. And that's because they're adding the snail-eating species, one that most people recognize as having been extinct for about 80 years now. So I wasn't really going to count that one. So it's currently recognized that there are 108 endemic species in Madagascar. 108 out of how many birds? That's a tougher question to answer. eBird currently lists 258 species using records going back to 1982. The definitive kind of field guide of the Birds of Madagascar is called Birds of Madagascar. It actually lists 331, but that's got a whole lot of records, historical records of vagrant birds. So that eBird count is a pretty reasonable number, I think, for things that you might have a chance of actually seeing. Okay, so before we start looking at the birds, I'm going to give you a little bit. I'm going to give you an outline of where I went on this particular trip. And after landing in the capital and changing planes, Tony and Nancy and I flew up to the far northeast here to an area called the Masala Peninsula, and it's characterized by lowland rainforest. And as I say, I picked that trip very deliberately, as you'll see, because it's got some species that are found nowhere else. After that, we went back to the capital, and the capital is actually, it's right around in here. It's in the Central Plateau, kind of towards the edge, getting close to the getting close to the rainforest, but very much on the in the Central Plateau. And this is a huge area, Central Plateau. It's dry, it's pretty much arid. And this is what it looks like when you fly in on an airplane. If you're coming from the northwest as I was, you end up flying for about 2.5 hours over countryside that looks like this. You can see a few bright little spots down in the bottoms where the rivers are, and otherwise very, very dry and very, very few trees left. It's estimated that over 90% of the country's forest cover has been stripped for agriculture, for livestock, for mining, and for timber extraction. The rate of forest loss has been slowed since the efforts of the Malagasy government stepped up in the 90s, but there's still a lot of pressure on what forest remains. And the pandemic has really exacerbated that, as I'll mention a little bit later. Back to my maps, after leaving the capital, we went to this long, narrow area here. This is where the highland rainforests are, and I'll talk about them in some detail in a minute. I didn't visit this strip at all. This is the rainiest part of Madagascar, the eastern coastline, and it's where a lot of agriculture takes place. There's a lot of fertile land there, but the rainforest has been cleared in this area where it's near the coast to plant cash crops like vanilla, cloves, coffee. These are high value crops for export. And the other local crops that are grown are sugarcane and bananas. And then after the rainforest, we visited an area of the dry forest down towards the south here. And this was on the tail end of the Central Plateau and then moving off it towards the coast. And finally, we ended up in, I should point out too, I didn't get to the West Coast at all, but this is a much drier region of the country over here. And what forests there are, and there are some national parks over here, are for the most, they're dry forests, unlike the eastern side of the country. And this is the driest part of the country of all, the Southwest. And this is where the spiny forest is, which I will end up with today. It's a weird and wonderful place. So we got in the plane, we flew back up to the north end of the country to this place called Masala Peninsula. There's a small town here that we flew into, overnighted, and then this is where we were going. And you'll notice there aren't a lot of roads. There's a main road that runs along this side of the bay and ends at the town. And there's almost nothing over on this side. Most of these coastal towns are accessible only by boat. And so that's how we got to this place, was by boat. And I say boat, but it was an open fishing skiff essentially. And it was a kind of pleasant 2.5 hour ride getting there. Going back was a different story. It rained for about an hour of that and there was no cover on the boat. So we got absolutely soaked, but we didn't have much choice. This is a picture from Google Earth and I really love it because that dark green, it shows you how much intact lowland rainforest there is. This is the largest concentration of lowland rainforest in the country. And a lot of this that we're looking at is protected, though elsewhere, not a lot of it's protected. And the lowland rainforest to the north of here, for instance, is disappearing at an alarming rate. This is what the rainforest looks like, lowland forest from the water as we came in on the boat. Don't get fooled by the word lowland, even though the elevation isn't particularly high. These hills rise very steeply from the water, and we were walking around on it. It had rained heavily the week before we got there, just a little bit while we were there. And the trails were narrow, muddy, steep, so it was strenuous at times, but very, very beautiful, as you can see, all these shades of green. There's my little hut for the 3 days I was there, nice accommodation. And right outside my hut was the first bird of this part of the trip. This is a lesser Vasa parrot, and it was up in the trees outside my room. These are very non-parrot-like parrots. They're mostly a kind of dull gray green color, and they've got that skin around the eye. And there's another species called the greater Vasa parrot, which looks almost identical. We saw some a couple days later. I would have been hard-pressed to sort the two out on my own. And there's another species of parrot we'll meet a little later in the trip. This was the first major target we had in the north. It's a short-legged ground roller. The ground rollers are one of those endemic families I previewed at the beginning. Within those the five species in the family, there are 3 genera represented. And these birds, the ground rollers, are probably the most sought after family by visiting birders because they're very elusive birds. They can be tough to see. They're all forest dwelling birds. And, you know, they've got these dark colors, although they'll have, some of them have these, you'll see some lovely highlights on them. And unlike true rollers, the ground rollers are largely terrestrial, although they do climb branches. And I did see this particular bird fly to hawk some insects. Birds of the World says about this particular family, given their restricted distribution and evolutionary distinctiveness, there are likely many more surprises to be uncovered about the species in this family if we can do so before they disappear, which sounds, you know, pretty discouraging. And the reason for that is 4 out of 5 of these birds have significant conservation concerns. It's because of the small ranges they occupy, the habitats they live in are vanishing, and because they're ground-dwelling bird predation, primarily by introduced rats. This is another major target. This is a cuckoo roller, and the cuckoo roller is interesting because it's the only bird, not only in its family, but in its order, the Leptosomniphores. And this is a male bird. Again, this particular picture is in great quality in really low light conditions. This is the same bird from a different angle. And you can see when you look at it from the front and the bottom, it looks like mostly a gray bird, but on the back and sides, it's got this iridescent green to it. And in flight, to me, it looks like a different bird in flight. The other interesting thing about them is that they're not related to either cuckoos or rollers. As I mentioned earlier, it's its own order. And it's described in Bird of Madagascar as a living fossil. This particular species, though, is considered a good omen by local people. It's considered to be a harbinger of good weather. And hence, people generally let this bird alone. It's widespread across Madagascar and adaptable to changing habitats, unlike a lot of the forest birds. So you'll find it in a lot of different places. So this bird is not threatened as many of the others I'm talking about are. I include this great Bob Lewis photograph of, I asked him which direction it was supposed to be. Was it supposed to go up or sideways? And he said, well, this is the way he saw it because he was underneath it. And I include it because this is a female. And he didn't see any males on his trip, and I didn't see any females on my trip. So it's nice to have this excellent picture by comparison to see how different the males and the females are. If you look closely at the heads, you really note the resemblance, but apart from that, you certainly don't notice any resemblance with the color. This is the bird that got me interested into going to Madagascar in the first place. It's the iconic species of the Masala Peninsula, the national park we were visiting. It's called the helmet Vanga. And Birds of Madagascar describes this one as a spectacular large Vanga and adds it's recognizable from all other birds of the forest by its outrageous blue bill. And as I go through more Vangas in this presentation, pay attention to the bills. This one certainly is the most outrageous. It's the biggest and it's the bluest. But the Vangas, the variety of bills is astonishing in this particular family of birds. These birds, they feed on insects, frogs, and small reptiles, and they're endangered because they are restricted to this primary low forest. And that forest, as I say, outside of this particular national park is quickly becoming fragmented. This individual bird was on that nest right alongside the trail, probably about 5, 6, maybe 8 feet off the trail. And we would walk by this bird several times a day. And I say this bird, although our guide told us it was probably 2 birds, a male and a female, because they take turns, they rotate on the nest, and they do take turns raising the chicks as well. But we always saw the bird in exactly the same position. We never saw the changeover. And we never saw it facing the other direction. So we thought about it as being a single bird. Just a note about the family of Vanga. There's 15 genera and 21 species. And of these, 12 are monospecific, meaning there's only one species in the genus. And there's a huge range of birds, as I mentioned earlier, but about the bills. The only things they seem to have in common is they're primarily insectivorous. The sexes are similar in most species, though not all. They're largely arboreal. Other than that, they have few features in common. They're an unbelievable diverse group of passerines. And Birds of Madagascar goes on to say that they are perhaps the world's most spectacular example of spectacular adaptive radiation. Because coming from a single ancestor, they became a lot of different looking birds. The most recent additions to the family were confirmed only in the last decade or so using DNA. Here we are in this picture. That's my friend Tony in his little white jungle suit, and we're off looking for another rarity. That's our guide, Joseph, in front of him. It's clear that those two guys had a really different ideas about what was appropriate rainforest wear. But we're off looking for a scaly-breasted roller, which we had heard in the distance. On the way, we encountered a little bit of a detour here, our first lemur. This is a red-ruffed lemur. It's a pretty good-sized one. It's a critically endangered local endemic. These are only found up in the Masala Peninsula. And like a lot of lemurs, we heard them before we saw them. They're really loud. The field guide describes its vocalization as extremely loud and distinctive, aggressive and almost agonized screaming, often given by a whole group in concert and answered by neighboring groups. There was a neighboring group, but it was pretty far in the distance, so it wasn't blasting us out like this particular individual was. Lemurs are, as many of you will know, Madagascar's most charismatic mammal species. There are 5 extant families, and there are 3 distinct, and a little more about them later on. This is the bird we were looking for. It's a scaly ground roller. So this is the second ground roller in the family of ground rollers that we saw up here. And it's a bird of the lowland rainforest too. This is probably one of the better places to see this bird. Birds of the World says it prefers dense and tangled vegetation with damp soil and deep leaf litter. That certainly describes where we saw this particular bird. We really located it because we heard it calling. I got a call I'm going to play. And it's not calling very often, but this one required some real effort to finally find it. And when we finally did find it, it just stood around and made this noise. All right, that's enough out of you. I'm sorry, let me go back. I didn't mean to go on. I wanted to mention a few of the other endemic rainforest birds that we saw that I'm not going to show you pictures of because I didn't get good enough pictures, but there are a lot of tetrachas up there, a family I'll talk about a little bit later. This is a family also referred to as the Madagascar warblers, and they have names like white-throated oxylabus and spectacled tetraca. And then there were common gerries from the Cisticola family. And we saw a lot of suimongus sunbirds, which we thought were wonderful to see. And then we realized these were all over the country. There are 2 species of sunbirds in the country, and they're not too difficult to see. And the final bird that we saw that was very exciting in this rainforest is Madagascar woodrail, which was a tough local endemic too. We had one other habitat that we were gonna, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot, nocturnal. I gotta talk about going on a night walk. Joseph asked us after a long day if we wanted to do a night walk, and none of us really did. We were all exhausted, but you never turn down a night walk in Madagascar because you see a whole different array of things at night. Because the majority of Madagascar's mammals are nocturnal. 3 of the 5 lemur families consist of nocturnal species. This particular lemur in this picture is the Masala mouse lemur. It's about the size of your fist, maybe a little bit bigger. It's a very small little mammal, and it's hardly known at all. I mean, it's barely described in the literature. If you try to look this one up on Google, you're not going to find much. It's a relatively undescribed species. The chameleon is a Parsons, And if the females are green, the males can be green. They can also be turquoise or yellow. This one's a juvenile. It's shedding its skin. And this one is probably a female. And I'll tell you why later in the show. Okay, last bit of different habitat we're going to finish before we go back to the Midlands. Before we go back to the Midlands. It's called the littoral forest. And a littoral forest, for those of you who haven't been to one, is a low-lying area that features salt-tolerant vegetation. We saw a suite of birds there, some of which overlapped with the birds in the rainforest and some of which were a bit different. We saw Nellicorvi weavers, and these are the weavers like you would see in Southern Africa. This one's a male. They're rainforest dwellers. And the males build weaver nests with the big 8-inch, they built a big bulbous nest with a long entrance tunnel leading to an oval-shaped chamber. We didn't see nests in this particular area. Tylus vanga, there's another one of these vangas. So this is a bird from the same family as that helmet vanga. You can see it looks totally different. It's got a much smaller, pretty ordinary looking bill and a completely different color scheme as well. The littoral forest was pretty good for vangas. We actually got this one there too. This is one of Bob Lewis's pictures, obviously not taken in the littoral forest. This was taken down in the spiny forest, but it's a hook-billed vanga, and these are pretty widespread across the country in a variety of habitats. In addition to these two, we also saw red-tailed vangas, we saw rufus vangas, and some of those vangas are really quick though, and some of them are terrestrial. The red-tailed vanga was just running along the ground before we could even get cameras up. It's gone. Okay, we leave the north, we fly back over all that brown expanse, and we end up in Antananarivo, or Tana, as the locals call it. It's the capital of Madagascar. It's right in the center of the country, on the edge of that central plateau. It's got 1.25 million people. The greater urban area has about 3 million. Total population in Madagascar, 28 million people. California's got 40 million. And the major difference is that Madagascar has no other city that comes anywhere near the size of Tana. So that the people are, that population is pretty spread out over the rest of the country. In Tana, we met Jason. He was our guide I mentioned earlier, our guide and photographer from Birding Ecotours. He's originally from South Africa. And we met Harry, who is our local guide, who was born and raised in Tana. Right in the middle of this photograph is a lake. Right here, this little tiny lake. It's Lake Alarobia. And it's a little nature reserve right in the middle of downtown Tana. It's got a huge 12 to 16 foot wall all the way around it. And outside is the city, and it's bustling and it's full of traffic and it's crowded and noisy. And you get inside and it's just this wonderful little oasis in there. It's the home to 14 threatened endemic species, including the Madagascar pond heron, Miller's duck, and the Madagascar little grebe. And this is what it looks like inside the gate. And you can see the fence over there in the left-hand side in the distance. What we're looking out at is called Bird Island. It's a major breeding site. The lake is actually a Ramsar site. As most of you know, Ramsar is the international treaty that tries to protect important wetlands. And it was and then what we were trying to do here in particular was see the Madagascar pond heron. And we had to pick it out on the island, and there were hundreds of herons on the island. And I got very excited when I saw this particular bird through my scope, because that to me looked like a Madagascar pond heron. They have this characteristic blue bill, and they got a little bit of blush to their feathers. And but unfortunately, that bird proved to be squacco heron, which also has a blue bill and a lot of blush to its feathers. Two lovely photos by Bob. The squaccos are common and they're widespread in Africa, but the pond herons are a very small population. It's estimated to only be between 1,300 and 4,000 individuals left in the country. And since it's endemic, that translates to the world. And habitat loss is mostly responsible for these birds' declining numbers, along with the competition from the squawkos, which seem to be pushing it out of some of its usual areas. And of course, the encroachment of things like rice paddies where wetlands used to be. And walking around the lake, lots of beautiful birds. This is Madagascar malachite kingfisher. It's similar to the malachite kingfisher you'd see in Southern Africa. The same with this bird, the Madagascar hoopoe. It's a common endemic. And if you've seen hoopoes in Europe or in Africa, I think you're hard pressed to tell this one apart from that, but they are 3 distinct species of hoopoe. This particular one has I think it's a cricket in its bill. And rather than eat that cricket itself, it was feeding a chick in a little knot hole here. I've got a nice look at. And while looking for that, endangered rail, we didn't find it, but we did find white-throated rail, which is much more common, and a nice bird to see in any case. So we had a great outing at this particular place, and next day we were ready to head to the rainforest. We actually visited 2 highland rainforest parks, Endemic Mentidea National Park and Rano Mafama, which is probably the most famous national park in Madagascar. Endemic is at an elevation of about 2,500 to 4,000 feet. 210 days of year it rains, and it's known for a variety of lemur species. There are 11 different lemur species in the park itself. Rano Mafama, similar elevation, gets up to 90 inches of rain a year. It's got 13 species of lemurs, and one of the big attractions is the which is the world's largest nocturnal primate. So it's a species of lemur. And unfortunately, I didn't get to see that one. And it's also that park's also famous for being the only location, the only residence of the golden bamboo lemur. This was unrecognized as a species until 1986 is when a population of these were discovered in this area. And the national park was actually established to protect this particular lemur, though the numbers are still declining due to habitat loss and hunting. There's only about 1,000 individuals of that species left in the wild. Okay, getting to those parks. First, we had to get out of town. This is what it can look like not only in Tana, but going through these local towns on the highway that line the highway. Everything comes to a crawl when you hit the town, and you can see why. Here's what the public transport looks like. This is an informal minibus. The doorman is loading the people up, taking their money, and the driver's on top loading the cargo. And then you end up driving through the countryside that a lot of it looks like this. And if you remember that view from the airplane, there was that little bit of green you could see amongst all that brown. And that's this. And the explanation for this is interesting. The Malagasy people are relative newcomers to this island. And they actually came from Southeast Asia between 1,500, 2,000 years ago. And they brought with them some land practices not well adapted to Madagascar's delicate ecosystem, including rice growing, right, from Indonesia. On the central plateau, much of the land has been cleared, and in the lower river bottoms, the fields are terraced like this. And most of that is rice. It accounts for about half of Madagascar's agricultural output. And the other major subsistence crops that are being grown here would be corn, cassava, potatoes. And then a second wave of settlers came from Eastern Africa about 500 to 800 years after the original Malagasy settlers. And they brought with them practices which were common in Southeastern Africa, also not suitable to this particular ecosystem. And mostly that was cattle raising. 60% of rural families in Madagascar depend upon rearing livestock as part of their living, with the main animal being the zebu. And the zebu is a species of domestic cattle that does well in tropical climates. And you're going to see one in this picture. Actually, you're going to see 2 of them in this picture. they're used for everything. As you can see, they're used here for working the fields. They're used for transportation. They pull carts. You'll see them, going down city streets pulling carts, and they're raised as meat animals too. So they're absolutely key to the economy of this country. And the other reason I include these slides in here is the rice farming is incredibly labor intensive, as you can see, using both zebu and people to do the work. And then within a lot of these lower bottoms, when they've cleared the rice out, rice can be very draining. And if they're not letting these fields go fallow and restore some of the nutrients, the land actually just goes dead. And then they end up becoming these big harvesting spots for mud, for brick building. And you'll see these brick building operations in some areas are just massive, like this one was. And it's what most of the local housing is made from, are these bricks from these river bottoms. But it's not helping the ecosystem to be digging it up like this. One of the real surprises for me are these images for a variety of reasons. In the upper left-hand corner, you're driving down the road and you come to this forestry that looks like that. That's eucalypt. And these are vast eucalypt plantations all over the center of Madagascar. And, we think of it as a monoculture, but it's being raised. In the bottom picture, you can see that the trees are getting cut down and the logs are getting stacked up. And in the upper right-hand corner, you can see there are these big pits. And what they're actually doing is making charcoal. Eucalypt makes up about half of the plantation wood grown in Madagascar. And in a lot of locations, dwindling supplies of charcoal force people to deplete the forests, and the eucalypt provides an alternative to this. Ends up providing 92% of the energy supply in the country for households. It's fast growing, unlike the native trees, and resprouts from stumps. So what I was thinking of as an ecological disaster in a way has this mixed use. It's actually doing some pretty good work here and taking a lot of the stress off the local forests. It's also a defense against erosion in areas that were formerly stripped of vegetation. And then finally, we get to the highland rainforest, and it's beautiful, as you can see. But even in protected areas like this, there's a lot of illegal timber cutting occurring, particularly involving high value species like rosewood, ebony, mahogany. There was a recent article in a journal called Nature Climate Change that describes how the forest could vanish completely in the next 60 years through a combination of deforestation, but also, of course, climate change, which is having a big impact. And this past year, all kinds of things, we all know what we went through here. All kinds of terrible things happened in Madagascar in addition to the pandemic. And there were big wildfires in particular that burned a lot of not just grassland area, but forest too. Huge wildfires, the same as we did last year. It's so climate change is obviously happening everywhere, but Madagascar is particularly vulnerable. So in the middle of this is in a national park, and this is a local village. And it's interesting because you can see that the village is still surrounded by forests. So a lot of the forest right around the buildings itself is secondary growth. And you can see on that far right side of the picture, that brown area where they're obviously clearing some land for some crops. So it's it's a kind of a delicate dance that the authorities do with the locals, because they're trying to protect the rainforest, but they've also got to help these people in what is one of the poorest countries in the world. One of the ways in which that's taking place is through tourism, is that a lot of the local people in these villages are being put to work on various kinds of research projects, but also just as guides, as what I learned were, when I said, when we went to Tana, we met Jason and Harry, who we thought of as our local guide. And then we get here and we find out that we have local guides. And it was a local guide, for instance, who found this bird for us. This is the collared nightjar. It's an endemic of the eastern forests. As I say, one of the local guys knew where this particular bird was and took us to see it. This is another one of those birds. It was recently placed in its own genus. It's thought to be pretty rare, but then there's speculation that because it's secretive and difficult to observe, it may simply be undercounted. People just don't know for sure about this bird. This is another bird we saw through the efforts of a local guide. This is a Madagascar long-eared owl, beautiful big bird. And again, we had a local guide who sort of knew where this bird was, and he took us to the area, and we got warbler's neck looking for an owl, and eventually found this one. You'd wonder how you could, you couldn't just pick out a bird that big, but given the canopy of the rainforest, it was tough. Next, we see a big bird that Tony and I found on its own. It was making this soft noise that was, we decided it was a nervous noise because when we finally spotted us, we noticed it was staring back at us. It's a Madagascar Ibis. They're found in a variety of woodland settings from dry forest to rainforest, but it seems to favor damp areas with leaf litter, and you find it along streams. And this particular pair, and there is a second bird in this picture, it's kind of indistinct behind the leaf down here. It was perched high up in a tree right over a stream, so it's exactly where the field guide said it would be. I love it when that happens. This little beautiful gem is a Madagascar pygmy kingfisher. It's a common bird of the rainforest. It's common in the highland rainforest, less common in the drier areas. This is a small bird. This bird's smaller than a sparrow. So we think that kingfishers as being kookaburras, etc., but they come in all sizes. This is, might look a little bit fuzzy, this photo, but this is actually the picture that I took on this trip that I am most proud of. It's the third ground roller from that family of ground rollers, the pitta-like ground roller. Great name, eh? And it appears that this particular ground roller is the least affected by habitat degradation. It's the one out of the 5 that it seems to be doing okay. It prefers dense original growth rainforest, but you can find it in drier forest and even secondary forest. This one, though, was in its preferred habitat. It was in dense rainforest at a great distance, and I got a glimpse of it between a lot of leaves, so that's why I was really so happy with this particular picture. And then the next day after seeing that bird, we saw this one, and this is the rufous-headed ground roller. And again, it's got the same kind of a habitat preference, except this one doesn't live in other habitats. It's not just a preference, it's a condition. And Birds of the World describes it as humid parts of lowland to high altitude rainforest, mostly an undisturbed dark forest, especially mossy montane forest with large trees, dark tangled understory vegetation, dense thickets, rotten fallen logs, damp soil, and deep leaf litter. Wow, perfect description for where we actually saw this bird. It turned out that this was the species that Jason, our guide, had gotten most worried about because Tony and I had caught on with that previous ground roller that we had 3 of the 5 already, and we started thinking about the possibility of getting all 5 ground rollers, and this is the one that Jason thought was going to be tough. So when he picked this one out, he was really relieved. And we go from the ground rollers back to the Vanga family, and a completely different Vanga again. This is the nuthatch Vanga, and this is a picture I mentioned at the outset. It was digiscoped by Joy Inbody, who was on the tour with us. It's just a terrific photo because this bird was a great distance away, and it's sitting on a nest. It's back up against the tree, and it's on a nest here. And it resembles our nuthatches in the way that it gleans insects as it ascends trees. But unlike true nuthatches, it doesn't descend trees. Birds of the World reports that there are very few records of this bird on nests, so we were fortunate seeing this one. This species is restricted to the eastern rainforests. And it's listed as a species of least concern, but it's entirely dependent on intact forests. So if the forest goes, the birds can go. Another one of my favorite birds over there, it's just a beautiful bird. It's so colorful. And this one I got so close to. This is a fairly common bird, actually, the Madagascar paradise flycatcher. And this one was in that little nest right off the trail. And I watched a group in front of our group walk right by this bird within about 3 feet, maybe, and nobody noticed this bird. And I thought, how could that happen? And I finally concluded it had to be because in that particular park, everybody is so focused looking up to try to see lemurs that you often miss what's right in front of you. Another Vanga, look at the, this has got a fatter bill too, pollens, and it's another Vanga on a nest as well. Two more Vangas on a nest across these Vangas, and these are actually, as you can see, are dimorphic. There are sex differences between these. These are primarily terrestrial birds, but obviously they're nesting in the tree. More Vangas. This is the rufus backed, and I'm sorry that the picture doesn't show his beautiful back. You can see there's a tiny bit of rufus in the picture and a little bit of white. It's beautiful rufus on the back and white on the front, but unfortunately all we can see of this one is its black head. And more nesting birds. This is the same Vanga we saw up north in the rainforest, the Tylus. But here you can see there's a pair of them. And Birds of Africa concludes that the color variations is really poorly understood, but it's generally thought that the male birds are the ones that are white below. That's the one behind the leaf there, and the females are cinnamon, but they still aren't quite sure about that. Apparently there have been reports of that color scheme being reversed in certain areas. This was a major target in the rainforest, this kind of plain looking brown bird, but this is one of the most difficult birds in the country to see. Brown massey. Birds of Madagascar describes it as occurring only in primary eastern rainforests at 1,000 meters, where even there it's rare. Very locally in degraded edges of primary forest, usually in pairs or family groups, on ridges or steep slopes, in dense vegetation, shy and hard to see. Well, there was a pair of these birds on a very steep slope in very dense vegetation, and the only way we got to see them is that there were a couple of local guides downslope, and they knew the birds were there, and the birds knew they were there, and the birds turned around and headed up to the trail where we were all stationed. And it was kind of like the experience that some of you probably had looking for rails, where they're right out in front of you somewhere and you just cannot see them. And Tony and I were next to each other, and we could hear these birds, and they were 3 feet from us. We knew they were close, and all of a sudden the head appeared. So these birds are part of, as I say, the family Macetes, and this is one of those families that actually constitute a separate order. The field guide describes the family as of uncertain affinities with 3 species and 2 genera. They're ground-dwelling birds. They have great difficulty flying. They hardly fly at all, and they're limited to native forests. All 3 of the species are threatened, and they have such severe habitat requirements. We'll meet another one later in the talk. This is another one of the major birds people go to Madagascar to see. And being there in breeding season, we saw it when it looked like this. This is a velvet acidy. In the breeding season, it's got that large flap of skin on the top of its head. It's called a caruncle. And it's got that beautiful lime green with the outline in the blue. And if you go see this bird in the non-breeding season, that color is much reduced, and that skin is actually about half of this size. So it still has it, but it's not prominent and shocking the way it is when these birds are in breeding plumage. The acides are a very old endemic family. The closest relatives are Asian and African broadbills. And there's two genera within the family. In each of the genera have 2 species. And I'm saying this because you're going to see the difference in a minute. So this one, this particular genus, its counterpart lives in the dry forest and is not nearly as colorful as this one. The second genus of this family is this genus, the common sunbird acidy. And it's easy to see where the bird gets its name from that bill. It looks a lot like a sunbird, but it's not even related to a sunbird. Again, it's convergent evolution. It's developed that bill to go after those flowers like that, given the conditions that it evolved in. So I mentioned earlier, there are 2 species of sunbirds. There were 2 species of these sunbird acides too. And this one is found in the same habitat as that velvet one in the tropical rainforest, the highland rainforest. And I saw this bird about a half hour after I think we saw the other one. We're going to move on now to reptiles. We saw a lot of reptiles in the rainforest. And for the purpose of brevity, I'm going to skip the snakes. I actually have some pretty good snake pictures, but we're going to start with geckos instead. And when we think of geckos, we usually think of something that looks like this. This is from the genus Phelsuma, the day geckos. And there are about 70 species of day geckos scattered throughout the Indian Ocean region. And about half of them are endemic to Madagascar. These geckos are the ones that travel very easily. You know, people put them in their luggage and take them home. And that's why we have big populations of these in Hawaii and in southern Florida. And they're called day geckos because they are, they're diurnal family. You see them out in the daytime. And they're beautiful. Most of them are green like this with patterning on them. So this is a lined day gecko. And this is a peacock day gecko, even more colorful. And then there's this other whole branch of the gecko family called the leaf-tailed geckos that are nothing like these, and that for the most part are nocturnal and much more, and the opposite of these are ostentatious, they're easy to see, and they actually can get pretty close to them before they scamper off. The leaf-tailed geckos do their work with camouflage. So this is a common leaf-tailed gecko. It's on the bottom side of that branch, and it's running the whole length of the branch. There's the eye and the head, and there's the tail. Common leaf-tailed gecko. This is, I think, my favorite, the mossy leaf-tailed gecko. Here's the eyes, here's the head, one of the legs, you can see the body, another leg, and it's actually had more tail up there too. So just astonishing coloration, but also texture in terms of the camouflage. And this is the one that people go looking for in Ranomafama in particular. It's called the satanic leaf-tailed gecko. It's a wonderful name. It's got the funny leaf tail, but it's also got those great little horns up there on its head too. Amazing little creatures, these. But they're kind of the appetizer course for the main dish, which of course is the chameleons. And these first pair are Oostelets chameleons. The females are green, and the male, and the one at the bottom there is a male Oostelets. So male and female, different color schemes. And that's the same with the parsons. We saw that little parsons in that night photo I showed you earlier. These are a couple parsons by day. The field guide says that the females are green and goes on to say the males can be green, turquoise, or yellow. It doesn't mention orange, but that orange creature there is a male parsons. And the one on the far end there is also a male. It's a green male, it's not a female. And the way that we know that is it's got those little horns on the top of its head. The females look like this, but they lack the horns. More chameleons. This is a carpet chameleon. And actually we were driving along the road and one of the guides saw this out of the window, which is pretty remarkable because it's only about 10 inches long. And I should have mentioned some of those geckos chameleons I was showing you previously, like the Oostelets, they get up to 2 feet long. They're big creatures. This is much smaller, about 10 inches, carpet chameleon. And we slammed on the brakes because we wanted to get a close look at this beautiful little creature. This is a brown leaf chameleon. This one's small, about 3 to 4 inches. And if you know, it's got these funny little horns on it. And this was on the leaf litter right next to the trail. We're lucky we didn't step on this one, given that camouflage. This was one of my favorite. I just think it's the funniest looking chameleon. It's called the cryptic or blue-legged chameleon. And the field guide's just got a great description. It says the male has a single modest nose horn. I guess that's modest. Looks pretty spectacular to me. And now we're going to go to what many people go to the rainforest to see, the lemurs. This particular lemur is the is the Indri, and it's in a family of its own. It's the heaviest living lemur. These things weigh between 13 and 21 pounds. And the voice is described often as one of the world's great natural sounds. And again, this is one that we heard it long before we saw it. They live in small groups of 2 to 6 individuals, with females being the dominant members. All right, that's enough of you. Thank you. Well, sorry. I wanted to say a little bit more about these guys because they are pretty amazing, the Indris. They're critically endangered, these animals. Oh, I know what I wanted to talk about with this slide. Given its size, as I mentioned, it's the heaviest lemur in Madagascar out of 115 species. But they have, the fossil record shows there to be at least 17 extinct lemur species, and all of them would have been larger than this one. And for instance, there was a branch of the family known as the koala lemurs, and they weighed close to 200 pounds. And there was one called the sloth lemur, which like the actual sloths we see in South America, would hang from the bottom side of branches. And with the particular sloth lemur, was thought to weigh almost 400 pounds. They were huge animals. So there has been a lot of extinction in Madagascar already. The diadem sifaka, another just a beautiful lemur. It's almost as big as the Indri, almost as vocal as the Indri, and certainly as active. There was a troop of these that we watched for quite a while. And then this one that I just like the way it looks. It's a beautiful creature, I think, the common brown lemur. And this one was quite interested in us, obviously. And one last animal before we leave the rainforest. We just finished a birding walk almost back to the car park, and up on the trail ahead of us, we saw this. This is the ring-tailed Vansira. It used to be called ring-tailed mongoose because they look like mongoose, and it's their closest living relative, although the relationship is distant. It's estimated the ancestor of these of the Vansira rafted over and from Eastern Africa about 18 to 24 million years ago, right? And so the ancestor gave rise to the family known as Eupleridae, and it's the carnivores endemic to Madagascar. There are only 10 species of them and 7 genera. And a lot of them look kind of like this, kind of mongoose-like. One of the ones that looks quite different is probably the most famous one, the Fusa. And if you're a fan of the film Madagascar, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. They've got a Fusa at the San Diego Zoo these days, and I was lucky to have seen it recently. The carnivores vary from being completely diurnal to completely nocturnal. So it was pretty exciting getting a chance to see this one. And shortly after we saw this one, we left the rainforest and headed south to the dry forest area. And so the habitat is going to change quite dramatically again. And on the way to the dry forest, we went through a lot of grasslands. And unfortunately, a lot of it looked like this. There was a lot of burning going on. And Harry, the local Madagascar guide, told me that over the years he'd been coming down to this end of the country. There's been more and more burning, and it's clearing land for agriculture and for zebu, but it's having a huge impact on native species, particularly birds down here. He said that when he first came down to this area, there were a lot of different species of raptors and big numbers of raptors. And I think all we saw down here were yellow-billed kites, and that was it. No other raptors. We did a lot of looking for raptors and didn't see them. But in the dry forest itself, when we got to the forest, once again, we were back looking at some remarkable birds. This is one of those. It's a giant kua, and this was a big bird. It was not as big as a wild turkey, but maybe a little bit bigger than a ring-necked pheasant. And it's a bird of the undergrowth that just wandered around and happened to wander close to me. One of the characteristics of the kuas, that particular genus I mentioned near the outset, is all 9 species have some kind of blue facial skin like this with a pattern on it. And obviously on this bird, it's pretty pronounced. Wonderful bird to see. A couple other local birds of the forest, the gray-headed lovebird. This is the third parrot that I mentioned earlier. And this bird isn't threatened, but they are captured for the local trade and they're kept as caged birds. So there is some pressure on the species. And the bird on the right is a Madagascar sparrowhawk. It's most commonly associated with the spiny forest, but this one was in the dry forest, but not yet into the spiny. And it's an accipiter. It's roughly the size of a sharp-shinned hawk. Another owl. This is a smaller owl, a white-browed owl, found in drier habitats. And it's the consensus these days is that this bird belongs in its own genus as well. This is probably the most charismatic of all animals in Madagascar, the lemurs in general, but this in particular, the ring-tailed lemur has a big fan following. And we went to a reserve that had lots of them. And as I mentioned earlier, it was springtime. These animals usually give birth in September. We were there in October. So there were lots of babies around. Most mothers only give birth to one kit. But this is, you can see that one of them has a single baby on the back, but the other one's got 2. And I think this one on the ground here is the same one as the one on the tree. I think it's the same individual. And she seemed to be a bit overwhelmed that day. These animals live in mixed sex groups of up to 30 people in which the females are dominant. And they're found in the southern third of the island, but the population is very fragmented due to deforestation. And that's going to have a big impact on its existence. They're also threatened, these by they're collected for the pet trade, and they're actually hunted for food, for bushmeat. Although the area, we were told by a local guide that they weren't hunted in this particular area because the local people had cultural injunctions against eating this particular species. But that may just have been the story for the tourists, I'm not sure. This is the most studied species in Madagascar. The first of the baobabs appear. This particular one is Madagascar's iconic species. It's the Endemism grandidieri, and it's the biggest baobab. Some of you will know there's actually 9 species of baobab in the world, and 6 of them are endemic to Madagascar. And there's a species on the African mainland and a couple of species in Australia. Now we're actually in the spiny forest. You can see it's weird and wonderful. Just an incredible array of plants. This is the Adensonia za, a different species of baobab, and this is the one that's common in the forest. And I'm not even sure the one in the middle, I spent some time with field guides, so I couldn't figure out which one that one is. But this is the area with the highest level of plant endemism in the country. 48% of the genera and 95% of the species are endemic. And many of these constituent plants show extreme adaptations to drought. And some of them, like the euphorbias, they resemble cacti, but they're very distantly related. It's another example of convergent evolution. Now to the birds of this area. This is the same species in the top and the bottom picture, a sub-desert brush warbler. And I like the 2 pictures just because they show the different kinds of vegetation. You'd be tempted to think it was a different bird, but it's not. They're birds of the dry Southwest, and these are found mostly in low coastal scrub. The Sakalava weaver is the counterpart to that one I showed you earlier, the Nellacurvi weaver, except the Nellacurvi is a bird of the wet forest, and this is a weaver found in the dry forests. And you can see from this individual bird here, he's got a long stick in his mouth, and he's building one of these elaborate nests. And they are communal birds. They have these large collections of nests. I think we saw one tree that had over 30 nests in it. And this particular bird, again, they're trying to sort it out through DNA. They think it might constitute its own genus as well. And the last bird on this page is the Thamnornis. And it's actually a member of that last big family of endemics I haven't really talked much about yet, the Tetrachas. It's a lot like that subdesert brush warbler to the right. They look very similar. They're in similar kind of habitat, but it's a completely different species. They are more restricted to the spiny forest than the subdesert brush warbler. About the Tetrachas, I'd say that this family was only recognized as being a distinct family in 2010, just a decade ago. It consists of 8 genera and 11 species. I mentioned earlier, they're sometimes called the Malagasy warblers. And all the species in this family are associated with primary forest. And most of them are restricted to rainforest. There are 3, though, that are restricted to the dry forest, including this particular one. And they live, for the most part, either in the understory or they're ground-dwelling birds. Now for a couple of more special ones. You should know by now what this is, given that blue around the eye. Another one of those kuas. This is the blue-eyed bird. It's a crested kua, this one. And this bird is the iconic bird of the South. This is the bird that people go to the spiny forest to see. You can tell my image is a little bit pixelated because I was shooting this from a real distance. It was very clear to see this bird, but it wasn't close. It was sitting on top of that pokey looking plant there with its bill open like that. And again, think back to the helmet Vanga with a huge blue bill and some of those other Vangas we saw. It's another bird with a strange bill. Lovely photo on the right was taken by Bob. You can see the coloration on the birds are much better in that photo because in addition to having that funny thing on their nose, they are beautiful birds too. This is one of the weirdest birds in Madagascar. It's another subdesert. It's another mesete. Remember the funny brown bird of the forest that we had trouble locating that was right under our feet? This is a close relative, the subdesert mesete. The first 2 birds in this family are birds of the rainforest, and this one is a bird of the dry forest. And I'm going to read you the whole description from Birds of Madagascar because it's just such a wonderful description. It says, extraordinary on at least morphological, vocal, and behavioral grounds, threatened and restricted to Southwest Madagascar, a terrestrial rail-like bird of the spiny forest with medium-long legs and bill, the latter decurved, sexually dichromic, living in groups of up to 10, led by dominant male, reproduction variably polygynous or polyandrous, sings in complex choruses. So it's a bird that there's a lot that's not known about this bird still. They're sorting around. And one of the things that's amazing about the spiny forest is these cryptic species like this one, the Madagascar nightjar. It's a fairly common bird throughout the country, but you can see in the spiny forest, boy, it really blends in there. And these are threatened by rats and domestic and feral cats. It's a problem we face here at home with a lot of our birds. And finally, it's the last of the ground rollers. This is the long-tailed ground roller, very cryptic in its habitat in the spiny forest. And it's one of the last birds I saw, and we were pretty thrilled to get it since it completed the sweep of the ground rollers. I'm going to end in the spiny forest on a mammal, a rather unusual mammal. This is a lesser hedgehog tenric. The tenrics are an endemic family of odd little creatures, 32 species in all, and they're widely diverse. Some of them resemble shrews, some resemble possums, some resemble rats, or like this one, hedgehogs. And the niche environments are equally diverse. There's an aquatic tenric, several arboreal ones, there's terrestrial tenrics, and there's even fossorial tenrics, ones that live underground. This particular one is nocturnal, as are most of them, and it's found both in trees and on the ground. And when threatened, these roll up into a ball, or they scurry away as this one did. During the dry season, they aestivate in hollow trees. And aestivation is a little bit like hibernation, except the cause of it is just the opposite. Hibernation obviously is caused by cold. Aestivation is caused by heat. So in the hot time of the year, these creatures go dormant in trees. Wow, you know, as I said at the outset, this was an amazing trip for me, and overall, I ended up seeing 153 species of birds. My target for Madagascar was 100, so I far exceeded that. I just had some great luck, and I had some good guides and some good friends with me who helped me as well. So that was exciting. But of the 153 species, 74, almost half of those birds were endemic birds. And the families that I mentioned earlier, we did really, really well on. And as I said, we got all the ground rollers. There's only one cuckoo roller, and we got the cuckoo roller. We got 2 of the 3 messetes. We got 2 of the 4 acides. The tetrachas, we got 8 of 11. And the vangas, we got 19 out of 21. And that family I mentioned, the kuas, the blue-eyed birds, we got 9 out of 9. As I say, I'm not counting that snail-eating one, which has been extinct for 80 years. I feel really lucky to have visited this magical place. It's very fragile, and it faces very serious ecological challenges. It's faced more challenges during the pandemic with tourism closed down. There's a lot of worry that local communities are back in the forests in order to survive. They're, you know, cutting down trees. They're killing animals. They're doing what it takes to survive. And there's a lot of researchers from Europe and North America doing work there and trying to keep their projects alive while this is going on. And it's been really touch and go for people. But I think I'll stop at this point, and we can do questions.
So Eric, while we're waiting for people to put questions in the chat,
Yes.
I'd like you to do me a favor.
Yeah.
Can you find your more box with the 3 dots?
Yeah. Maybe.
And can you open it and check share computer sound?
Yeah. Oh, were the birds not
Then
playing?
you go back and
Yep.
play the lemurs.
Play the lemur. Okay.
So we could not hear it. And I think it was because everybody, I'm sorry you have to see the sausage being made. In rehearsal, we really did share computer sound well.
Yeah.
We didn't hear the lemur, Eric, and I think.
Oh, really? Or there was another bird too that.
But especially if you can
Okay.
go back and re-share.
Yep.
And be sure to share computer sound.
Yeah. Check the box. Oh yeah.
And we want to hear the lemurs.
Yeah. Okay.
So whatever you need to do.
Yeah, I won't play that roller because it's not as good. The lemur is very special though. So
yeah. So everybody will get him to.
I checked the box whether it worked or not. Here it is. It's this guy.
And then do the slideshow.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Right. Current slide.
Now try it for us. Whoops. Okay, have patience.
There it comes. Here it comes. Okay, let's see if it's going to play now. Yeah, you know, things always work better in rehearsal. Okay. Are you hearing it?
Yes.
Pretty good, huh? And this is actually what a lot of the lemurs sound like. That first one I showed you, the red ruff, sounded a lot like this. And the diadem cephacus sounded a lot like this. So this was kind of a common noise that we heard when we were lemur hunting. And how are you getting any questions?
We don't really have any specific questions.
Really? Because the other thing, I can try to go back and also play, I can try to play that one roller as well, maybe.
Okay. I just want to let folks know that because we'd like to accommodate large numbers of folks in our speaker series, we have to set them up as webinars, which are essentially view only, listen only kind of experiences. But we were up to 131 attendees for this. So you need to use the chat if there's anything you'd like to ask or say. And then just to end the evening, when Eric is done, I'm going to say just a little bit about what's coming up for next month's speaker. So here we go.
Yeah, this is that scaly ground roller, and it's yeah. We heard this bird for about a half hour before we finally found it. It's very difficult to find this bird. And you look at it and it's got enough color on it that you think it shouldn't be that tough. But then if you remember the picture of the last ground roller I showed you, that long-tailed one in the dry forest, they just, you know, their color is just perfectly suited to their habitat.
So we do have a question.
Yeah.
What species is the lemur group most closely related to? If you think especially of Africa or Southern Hemisphere?
Well, yeah, I don't know exactly, but you know, they're primates. People often forget that about them. They're primates, but they have developed in isolation. So there's nothing they're particularly close to, because you know that they were separate from Africa for 88 million years. A long time, and you know, evolutionary long time.
And we also have a question about longitude and latitude for Madagascar.
Yeah, well, it's obviously Southern Hemisphere and it's tropical, so it's within the tropical region, right? But it's not too far south, because I mean, people forget that about Africa, that it extends pretty far. For a lot of my career, I taught in Southern Africa, and I would have students turn up in Cape Town in the winter, which is exactly like winter in California. And they'd be wearing shorts and t-shirts and be shocked that the weather was so different. But this is tropical weather, and it was always pretty warm when we were there. It could be a little cooler at night in the mountains because you're at elevation. You're at, you know, between 2,500 and 4,000 feet. The central plateau is about 3,000 feet, but it was a warm time of year. I thought October was a great time of year because it was a transitional. It was between the dry and the wet. And so we did get a little bit of rain, but for the most part, it wasn't. So we had the advantage of having had rains earlier, but we didn't get too rained on. So that was nice.
So
as I mentioned, some of those national parks get, you know, I mean, the one I mentioned gets 90 inches of rain a year. So you really do want to think about what time, if you're going to visit, what time of year you're going to visit.
So we have the wisdom of the attendees. We have a comment that Ashok says, lemurs became extinct in Africa due to other primates competing with resources. And our expert Bob Lewis says, according to Google, for what it's worth, the closest relative to lemurs are bush babies or galagos.
That actually makes sense. I've seen bush babies, and there is some superficial resemblance, though bush babies are a lot smaller and even much harder to see.
And this is a quirky way to ask it, but are any of the snakes bad actors? Are they poisonous?
Well, no, I don't know about poisonous snakes. Oh, let me see. I'm back on screen. I don't know about poisonous snakes. I don't know if there are any. There are constrictors. There is a Madagascar boa, and we saw a very large one. We saw one that must have been 15, 20 feet long. Big snakes, so they're big snakes. But most of the snakes we saw were smaller snakes, like our garter snakes, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Well, Ashok, again, no poisonous. Yeah, I didn't think so.
Okay.
I see the question about French speaking. Yes, it was a French colony for quite a while, though it was one of the places where the French really had their hands full, and they didn't do well there. And they really gotten beaten up by the local people. But French is still spoken widely. It's there are a lot of dialects of Malagasy spoken, and after that, French is common everywhere. So if you speak French, you do very well there. And in fact, in the tourist areas, there's going to be people who speak English as well.
Do you have any information about vanilla? Did you see where it was grown, or
Yeah, I didn't. It was down on the
plantations or habitats where there might
it's
also
grown
be
on
birds?
plantations, and it's a fairly labor intensive crop, which explains and it's not a crop that produces a lot of fruit, so hence the prices. If you go into the markets in Tana, it's one of those things that everybody's selling in the market. They'll have these long glass tubes with either 1 pod or 2 pods or 3 pods. And on my last day there, I was trying to buy some vanilla to bring home and trying to make deals with people. And they don't actually deal much with vanilla. They won't make a deal with you because, they know what it sells for. And even in the markets, you're not going to get too much of a break on the price.
Okay,
I think about 90% of the world's crop is grown in Madagascar.
And Ashok put a nice comment, but he only sent the chat to the panelists. So Ashok, if you're the one who put up the URL to nature, if you would like to repeat that and share it with all panelists and attendees, so everybody can pick up the link. And meanwhile, I want to say just a little bit about what's coming up next month, because we will have our typical third Thursday of the month speaker series. Nathan Piplo will be talking about female bird song, and the title of his talk is Listen to Her Sing. So somebody asked about the recording for this. Yes, because we will put the link to the recording on the Golden Gate Audubon website probably tomorrow morning. And a follow-up about the vanilla from someone, Julie seems to know quite a bit. She says the vanilla orchid is actually indigenous to Mexico and found life as a plantation crop in Madagascar, in one of those great Pan-Pacific exchanges. But I would say that anyone who wants to look at vanilla and Madagascar and birds, we would love to see some posts about this to follow up in our GGAS chat, right? Because we can continue the conversation there. There's information on our website about how to join the GGAS chat. You can set it up so you get a digest every day if you don't want a whole lot of emails. But I think a good use of the chat would be some follow-up conversation for questions about the other animals in Madagascar and the vanilla. And with that, we will have a great virtual round of applause for Eric. And I'm going to stop the recording and give people a couple of minutes to leave the meeting gracefully. And there are always more good questions than any of us can answer. But thanks to Eric for putting this together and for sharing this unusual and both magic and fragile place with us.
Yeah, and hey, I would add finally that if people do have questions about Madagascar, please feel free to email me. I'm easy to get a hold of, and I'm happy to answer your questions about it. Especially if you're thinking about planning a trip visiting, I can give you information on whether the birding ecotours trip would work for you or whether you might want to look into something else.
And I am going to put EJ, etc. at ucdavis.edu in the chat so people can pick that up.
I actually have a Golden Gate Audubon email address, but nobody ever writes to me on it. So.
Well, do you want us to put that in the chat?
No, The other one, I look at the other one every day. So
Okay. Thanks, everybody. And as I said, it will have a link on the Golden Gate Audubon website for you tomorrow morning. So bye for now.